And so let me dive right in to, and as Ebret said, delighted to have you pose your questions and comments. Want to open this up to conversation and really hear what you're doing. But I think he also set the expectation that we should present the paper with the assumption that you haven't read it. And I don't want you to have read it, but perhaps you will after. It was actually published in 2021. It came out in a special issue or as an essay in Strategic Organization. We were invited by Paula Jarzabkowski to put some ideas forward that were related to sustainability. It was also very much written during the time of the pandemic, when it felt like thinking about the large scale, especially biophysical, but not exclusively biophysical, sort of shifts and changes that our planet and its people are facing and undergoing, felt like a really important thing in terms of how we think about and guide not just organization theory, but organizational actions. And so, yes, largely based on Brooke's dissertation, which was done some years ago now, we were both very, very interested in what does organizational theory that deals with adaptation have to say that is relevant to today's issues, especially those that involve biophysical shifts, which, as you'll see, are both large scale, but also manifest at small scale. So that's the paper. Here's what we're going to do today. So first take you through, hopefully convince you that we might not need fundamentally new theories of organizational adaptation. And that's meant to be of, not or. But we definitely need to rethink the assumptions in our existing theory about organizational adaptation and ask if it's fit for purpose in today's environment. We then in the paper sort of integrate insights from ecological and systems theory to open up some areas, some avenues that we think would be productive for people who want to study and theorize about how organizations need to adapt in this current era. And then we'd like to open, as we said, for questions, discussion, and thoughts and feedback. We are working on an empirical paper. We have been working on it for a while, but we continue to work on it. And Brooke's done some other papers using empirical data on this topic. So we hope to just feed a little bit of that in and also take questions on that. But currently the essay is a conceptual piece. Okay, why do we need new theories of organizational adaptation? I'm going to flip through a series of charts very, very quickly. Your only job, and I want you to start putting it in the chat when I say go, once I've done flipping through all the charts, your only job is to sort of tell me what the trend is, what's going on in these charts. So here we go. And that was all of them, in case you need a refresher. So start putting it in the chat. What does it look like? What's going on here? Any observations about these trends? Up. Well done, Dennis. Beat everyone to it. Exponential growth. Tragedy of the commons. We've got some conceptual stuff here. Okay. Okay, ecological change. Keep going. Human action, all of the above. Eldon, you and me both. We're both Canadians. We can't not see a hockey stick, right? Okay, S-shaped growth. I'm not seeing the S-shaped growth, but some of it is a bit S-shaped. Okay. Love the distributions. Thank you, Wendy. Okay, tipping points, possibly, Charlotte, and correlation of growth. Okay, so Diana, you might have done this in your own teaching. I use this a lot in teaching. It's called the Great Acceleration, brought to you by the same group that did the planetary boundaries, but this is less well known and they don't keep updating it as they do with the planetary boundaries framework. But Joachim Rockström and others were actually the genesis of this work on the Great Acceleration. And indeed, we are speaking with a bunch of academics. So there's great comments in the chat. I won't be able to go into all of them in detail. When I show this trend to MBAs, they inevitably say, things are going up. And I go, yes. And when I show it to undergraduate engineering students who I also teach about sustainable business, they start talking about exponential growths and the distribution, as you have done, right? So, but we're all right. We're all right. And the fact is, things are going up. It can look a bit like a hockey stick, especially if you're Canadian. And they're going up in a particular way, which shows, as the label says, a great acceleration. Now, did anyone notice there was one date that is called out in red? And what is that date? Put it in the chat and you get extra points. Wendy, beat everyone to it. 1950. Why 1950? Why should we care about 1950? What magical thing happened in 1950 that would make everything, quote, go up? Any thoughts? Pop that in the chat if you have a thought. Okay. End of World War II. Anything else? Plastic was invented. Yeah. I don't know exactly when plastic vaccinations and antibiotics. Okay. Actually, I think vaccinations earlier, but okay. Social science. Yeah. Colonization was ending. Well, that's, yeah. Okay. Okay, we've got Industrial Revolution. So a couple of things, actually, just so you know, the Industrial Revolution was a whole 100 years prior. So the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution was sort of about 1850. But indeed, the ending of the Second World War, and more importantly, the sort of post-World Wars growth period was contributing a lot to this. Now, commercial jetliners, telecommunications, all sorts of things were actually accelerated by the war effort. So these things are not uncorrelated. Massive growth in not only, as Charlene says, population, but also in GDP. The invention of plastics, all of these things that you see as the socioeconomic trends on the left-hand side of the diagram were generally seen as markers of growth. And there was rampant growth post-World War II that, yes, began with the Industrial Revolution, but really didn't take hold, as these diagrams show, until about 100 years later. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, as some of you have already pointed out in the chat, we have the effects on the Earth systems. So what we might not have detected soon enough, but as somebody pointed out, Tragedy of the Commons works that way, which is we tend to see a lag in time between the large-scale effects and the things that contributed to the effects. So while we had growths in population, growths in well-being as measured by GDP, which may or may not be well-being, and increasingly we're realizing it's not, but growth in economic potential, we see the, quote, side effects in terms of affecting every area of the Earth system, which is not just climate-related issues. Obviously, we see CO2 trends, and there's some other climate change. Whoops, sorry, I jumped ahead by mistake. Other climate change gases are up here. Nitrous oxide and methane also contribute to climate change, but all sorts of other effects that are going on, including overfishing, loss of tropical forest, and changes in land use. So those are sort of the good things are in red. They're all going up after 1950 in an accelerating fashion. The, quote, bad things or the consequences are also going up. With some time lags and some missing data. I guess nobody really measured shrimp aquaculture for all those years, but now we think it's important to measure. And so it's not perfect data, but it basically gives you this picture. Okay, so now let's keep that year 1950 in mind. And I'm sorry it's 1955, and I'm sorry it's more US focused, but when you go back to 1955, the largest companies in the US were probably, frankly, the largest global companies. And this is who we were dealing with back in that era as sort of the key big companies in terms of revenues and profitability, which we can also probably surmise has something to do with their impact and their footprint. Interestingly, they're kind of some of the big players that we still see around, actually. Strictly, I think ExxonMobil was actually part of Standard Oil at the time, but I'm not a historian. But, they're the big builders of stuff, right? They made cars, General Motors, Chrysler, they made stuff. US Steel, General Electric, energy infrastructure and building infrastructure is certainly a big part of what they do. And they burned fossil fuels in the case of ExxonMobil, or used fossil fuels, extracted fossil fuels, and enabled the rest of us to burn them. I honestly don't know what ESMARC is, but when you look at this list of the largest companies in the 1950s that are more global, you certainly get these extractive industries in it. Okay, why am I showing you this? Mostly to say that the companies that we think of that were there at the time that things started taking off are actually the very same companies that our organization theory was founded around. So those of you younger than me, and most of you probably are younger than me, and even if you're not, business schools, organization theory, management theory didn't come into existence until post the 1950s. So we could have a hockey stick as well if we actually showed our output, our publications. But one thing that would be interesting about that is our publications have increased, but our theories have not changed that much, is what I'm trying to argue. In the 1950s and 1960s, as business schools were founded, as these large dominant corporations were on the scene, we suddenly had an interest in management theory. What drives growth? What do companies do in order to, how do they configure in order to configure effectively and efficiently to meet the markets that they're in, to integrate internally? All of the major management theories that we still use were basically founded in what Jerry Davis has called the Cambrian explosion of management theory that occurred post-1950s, really in the 1960s and 70s. And when you think about it, institutional theory has been around since then. Resource dependence theory has been around since then. We may not use those explicitly so much these days, but we use derivatives of them. Some of you in the room, I'm seeing Wendy, for example, theories about paradox are relatively new, but we can count on relatively few fingers how many brand new organization theories have actually come around. Many of them were seeded at this time when we had a very different world, when we were just starting this explosion in terms of not just social impact, but also environmental impact. And we had in mind at the time of the founding of all of this theory and at the founding of business schools themselves, certain types of companies. Okay, so I digress and I'm taking too long, but I asked our friend ChatGPT, what were the characteristics of companies in 1950s? Because I wanted to know, has anything changed? And this is what ChatGPT came back with, not necessarily specifically about General Motors, et cetera, but actually ChatGPT was able to list for me the largest companies in the 1950s, and then told me these corporations shared several core features. We know we shouldn't trust everything ChatGPT tells us, but these sound pretty good, right? Vertical integration. This was the point at which many companies were controlling other parts of their supply chain. There was diversification. So we found as companies got larger, they actually started to move into other areas. So you would build automobiles as well as finance the purchase of automobiles. And both of these became major portions of your operations, as well as becoming vertically integrated. This, not surprisingly, would lead to market dominance, especially in certain regions or sectors. Innovation and research often drove advancement, but it was innovation within certain areas, even though we had electric vehicles actually since the 1800s, and 1/3 of vehicles on US roads in the year 1900 were electric. General Motors, Chrysler, and others that you saw on that list gave dominance of certain types of technologies, and in this case, the internal combustion engine, and kept embedding and improving along certain technological trajectories because of their size and scope and market dominance. And then, of course, we started to see the global reach and presence. And so today, actually, interestingly enough, some of the largest companies have changed completely, but some of them haven't. Okay, so ChatGPT also says this last line: these organizations were key players in shaping the economy and industry standards of the 1950s, wielding substantial influence and often setting benchmarks for others to follow. Fantastic. I would argue that we as organizational scholars, or those organizational scholars working in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, as our field was emerging, were also informed by the dominance of these kind of companies. The forms that these companies took became dominant. And I would argue that today, most organizations, unless you're one of these startups and flat and networked, which frankly, as you grow, there aren't so many out there, kind of look a little bit like General Motors did. I mean, with a lot of tweaks, but they kind of look a lot like General Motors did, and Exxon probably looks still like Exxon did. So we have embedded a notion of what organizations are, what they look like, how we theorize around them, that is probably no longer fit for purpose, given the chart that you've just seen and given the changes that we know have happened since the 1950s. Okay, so I'm going to try to show you this video, and if it doesn't work, I'll précis it. But this is none other than Joachim Rockström, who is known for his work on the planetary boundaries, telling us how much the world has changed, the biophysical world has changed since the 1950s. It's a couple minutes long, and it's based on an address he gave at Davos earlier this year. So let me see if I can get it playing.
These are the 16 tipping elements, the large biophysical systems that we have scientific evidence that regulates the state of the entire climate system on Earth. 9 of these 16 are showing signs of instability. Push them too far, and they will shift over from supporting humanity to starting to undermine humanity. 4 of these are showing scientific evidence. Ice sheet, accelerated melting, warming 4 times faster than the planet as a whole, releasing cold, fresh water, slowing down the overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, pushing the whole monsoon system down further south, causing droughts and forest fires over the Amazon rainforest. 1 more tipping element system, locking warm surface water in the Southern Ocean, accelerating the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet. The North Pole is connected to the South Pole in regulating the stability of the entire Earth system. Dear friends, scientifically, this is not a climate crisis. We are now facing something deeper: mass extinction, air pollution, undermining ecosystem functions, really putting humanity's future at risk. This is a planetary crisis.
Okay, sorry about goofing up this the sound, but there were subtitles nonetheless. So the world of 2023, the biophysical world of 2023 is not just facing climate crisis, but facing significant, and I think that's sort of an ultimate definition of tipping point, when the North Pole is connected to the South Pole biophysically. So this basically causes us, or should cause us, I hope, to ask through these various provocations of what our organizations were, where we are now, whether our theories of organizational adaptation have kept up. So this is now switching over to what we actually do say in the paper. And we do argue that, of course, there's no single theory of organizational adaptation. So having said, many of the theories that we use today as organizational scholars were emerging and developed in the 60s and 70s at the birth of our field. We still haven't really labeled the theory organizational adaptation, but many, many scholars have looked at the phenomenon of organizational adaptation nonetheless. And generally what they're doing is they're saying, what ways do organizations have to change to meet the environments that they're in? And when they say environment, they do not mean biophysical environment. They do not mean what's going on with what Joachim Rockström just said. They mean the competitive environment, the technological environment, the regulatory environment, and more recently, the sort of social and stakeholder environment. So when we first originated ideas about organizational adaptation, they weren't adapting to biophysical systems. Biophysical systems were more or less seen as stable. The climate wasn't really changing, or at least not in a way that people believed or could detect in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So adaptation was about what your competition was doing. Adaptation was about what technology developments were going on. Adaptation was, how much would you vertically integrate, et cetera. So a lot of the theories that dealt with how organizations were changing conceived of the environment in that way. There were a number of ways that organizational scholars did consider organizational adaptation. I won't go into the details. You can see it all in the paper, but there are a number of different triggers for adaptation. So there could be jolts and short-term shocks. There could be long-term trends, trajectories in technology, for example. There were different sources, different places that those triggers, that either jolts or trends came from, obviously. And then different mechanisms were theorized of how organizations actually adapted. In the paper, we unpack how the mechanisms really fall very broadly into two large groups. One which gives much more role for managerial agency. So managers, leaders in organizations are agentic in terms of being able to steer the organization, make decisions, take actions, and respond to shifts in the environment that count, that matter, that actually shape the organization going forward. Another set of theories was much more leaning towards the role of the environment in driving these processes, so gave managerial agency relatively less of a role. These are theories that would take a sort of variation and selection approach to organizational adaptation, and basically say the environment selects for the fittest organizations, and there's relatively limited role for managerial agency. As one of you already put in the chat, we no longer think in such and or terms, or either or terms, sorry. We even over time, organizational adaptation explanations kind of saw, sorry, I don't want to show you that, saw a blending of agency and environmental selection working. Okay, so it wasn't just one or the other. There were various ways that theorists put this together. Nonetheless, whether it was co-evolutionary, adaptive, et cetera, and there were many ways that theorists approached this. Most theories of organizational adaptation, most explanations of organizational adaptation rely on what we call a logic of fit between the organization and the environment. So the assumption was, no matter how you did it, through managerial agency or some other process, if your organizational configuration, which meant your structure, your decision-making processes, et cetera, fitted the environment that you were facing, and remember, it wasn't a biophysical environment, it was everything else, then you would be fine. And if it didn't, then you would adjust, or it would adjust, or it would adjust you to configure to a way that there was a better fit achieved. So more recent work obviously started to see fit as more dynamic, and this notion of organizations and environments as co-evolving. So it sort of gave some more dynamism to what could be conceived as sort of one-sided or static explanations. However, despite all of this, Brooke and I in the article argue that we're actually still not seeing the whole picture in terms of what organization adaptation theories ought to or might do if we were to actually account for the world that we live in now, which Johan Rockström showed as an extreme version of in the video. But we all know that, climate change is present and obvious today. We know that the changes in the atmosphere are going to bring more climate change, even if we were to turn off the taps and stop all fossil fuel-based emissions tomorrow, which will be impossible. So we know that the climate is changing. We know that there are changes to nature and biodiversity that are potentially irreversible. And so what do those kinds of shifts ask us to think about in terms of organizational adaptation theory? So first, we notice and we call out that many of the theories of organizational change, organizational adaptation, refract these biophysical systems and their implications through other pressures. Not bad, not wrong, and I've done it in my own work, right? So I'm not really calling anyone out here. in the paper, we just say, yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because we talk about these pressures on organizations as coming through regulation, as coming through financial impacts, stakeholder, supply chain, whatever, right? Whatever issue. Only very, very recently have organizational theorists started to say, hey, climate change itself as a biophysical reality is actually impacting how organizations take decisions, structure themselves, go about their business. And that's really interesting because we've had 20, 25 years of work that has taken seriously environmental and social change and its impact on organizations, but it's largely been through these other channels. So it's time now, we argue in the paper, to actually look as well at the actual biophysical effects. And anyone who's read a newspaper in the last 2 years has noticed, factories are forced to close down when there's a flood. That affects supply chains. So there are direct, real effects coming that organizations need to adapt to, not just coming, but present. And the second point we make about why we need to adapt our organizational theories around adaptation is that there are many, many diverse temporal and spatial scales over which biophysical shifts play out. That doesn't mean that everything is complex and impossible to understand. The flood will occur somewhere, but the interactions that lead to that flood occurring somewhere are multiple. And it's very, very difficult for organizations to anticipate and perceive and attend to impacts when they're so dispersed. And I'm not going to steal Brooke's thunder because she's going to explain why they're so dispersed. But basically, the planet has a different way of dealing with scale than we as humans within organizations are. We tend to select a certain thing to attend to. Tima Bonsall and her co-authors have written a great deal about how organizations, look at things through a certain lens on a certain attentional span, which actually may or may not be and often isn't appropriate to dealing with biophysical changes because of the time scales and spatial scales upon which they play out and have impact. The final point, and then I am going to hand it over to Brooke, is that all of the prior theory on organizational adaptation works as if the organization is the thing that needs to change. So there's been an overemphasis on the organization as a single focal actor. The environment is shifting around us. We will change in the following ways. We'll achieve this fit, and then all will be fine. And we argue that this actually is the wrong unit of analysis when we're looking at interdependent systems. What we're trying to optimize for is a functioning system, as opposed to everyone wins as an organization. And I think that's one of the deepest challenges, actually, for me conceptually about all of this, which is that when we are talking about adaptation, we're not talking about optimizing any given thing, because optimizing any given thing is what's led us to these sort of post-1950 curves. And not everyone can win in the same way that we've seen this inexorable growth against constraints in the biophysical system. So without further ado, Brooke, I want you to take it away and tell everyone what the answer is, or what our answer is in the paper. Do you want me to I'll just flip through if you're okay with me controlling the slides?
Yeah, you can just advance as I talk, as it makes sense. Well, yeah, so we have some ideas for what Jen has set up as kind of the problem and challenges, I should say, from how our theory has developed over time. And we think that, with the biophysical environment, when we talk about that and, how would we theorize organizational adaptation, including the biophysical environment, we actually think that ecological theory is very helpful, and systems theory together. And actually, ecological theory provides us with a systems-based set of theories as well. So each ecological theories of adaptation, there's actually quite a bit of work in ecology on adaptation as well. Some of you may be familiar with the adaptive cycle, the loop, and the theory of resilience from an ecology point of view. Planetary systems and biophysical systems actually provide us with constraints. So if we're looking at, how do organizations adapt to something like climate change, we can actually look to how the natural environment works and work within those constraints, kind of adopt them as another layer of constraints to work within. And thinking about how these, we are embedded as organizational scholars, as organizations, as economies and societies nested inside ecological systems. And ecology theorists have been working for a while on this concept of social ecological systems. I'm sure that some of you have been seeing this term appear in our literature recently as well. And what this does is it puts together the social and ecological. It says you cannot understand social systems without also considering the ecological, because social systems are nested within the ecological. You also can't really understand the ecological systems unless you also consider the social, because as humans, as organizations, we have a lot of impacts on the natural environment. We draw resources from it, we extract, we use those resources. We also produce waste. So these are inextricably linked, and ecology theory provides us with that framework already. So that's very helpful. And one of the things that social ecological systems does for us is, it brings in these ideas of scale, which Jen has already mentioned as a challenge for us. And that's Tima Bonsall and co-authors' work on, we'll talk about in a minute, but one of the things that becomes very complex in bringing in social ecological systems is it says that, yes, these systems are nested. And what I mean by that is, we have the broader system of planet Earth and the planetary systems that Johan Rockström, that we heard about there, how those work, how those are interconnect. And then within that broader system, we have all of these narrower systems. And so you have these nested systems. And we often think about relationships between those nested systems as being very hierarchical or linear. If you go from one narrow system up one level, the effects that happen at that narrow scale go up, and the effects that happen at the broader scale ripple down. Work in ecology has shown that actually, yes, there are some hierarchical effects, but there's also what they call panarchical, which that you cannot necessarily, predict a linear or hierarchical relationship between systems. It is a complex adaptive system, and the effects that happen in one little area of the system may appear, there may be, impacts that appear in a different part of another system that you didn't anticipate. So it just kind of opens up our mind to the complexity of the biophysical environment, and that it's by nature very different than other systems we've studied, like regulatory systems, social systems, economic systems, different in nature, different characteristics. And this brings in the idea that we need to adapt collectively as organizations. Maybe there's some work that individual organizations can and should do, but there also has to be attention collectively to adapting to this complexity. And so we have an example of this panarchical complex system and how kind of the social and ecological mashed up. So in my part of where I live just near Yellowstone National Park in Montana. And I actually live in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem because it's very big. Back when colonists came to the area to settle in the 1800s, they, wanted to settle farms and have livestock and grow crops, just as anybody would want to do to survive. And, but they show up and they have to deal with wolves and bears and, all sorts of big alpha predators that want to eat their livestock, that eat the deer and the elk that they want to hunt for food. And so they actually start to kill the wolves. And, that seems like a very logical, straightforward solution. The wolves are killing our food source. We will eradicate the wolves. And what they come to find out is by eliminating the alpha predator, the US actually did implement a federal law back in the day to support the killing of predators, to support the local economies that were rising up, that were forming. They found that it actually destabilized the entire ecosystem of the region to the point where very broad effects could be seen, such as vegetation dying out. Actually, at first, the deer and elk population boomed because they weren't being eaten, but then they died off again because they overgrazed, and all the plants started dying, and then the deer and elk started dying. All of the vegetation that their cows and cattle and everything else sheep grazed on went away. And even to the point where we saw river systems change course because the soil had loosened up so much. These are things you can't necessarily, especially at the time, had thought, we're going to kill wolves and have more livestock, and now all of a sudden our entire ecosystem can't support our way of life. So back in the 1970s, researchers reintroduced wolves to the landscape. And as a resident of the area, I'm plugged into that topic, and it's the ecosystem has rebounded significantly. So that's just an example of panarchical kind of relationships and how complex the natural environment is. And so the kind of different considerations that we need to consider. And so how do we think that, what are some ways that we think that we can use this kind of thinking that ecology has put forward to inform our thinking around adaptation theory for organizations moving forward? Go ahead, Jen, and advance. Thank you. So we need to think about, what mechanisms contribute to ongoing adaptation. If the natural environment is very adaptive, complex, it's these panarchical relationships, maybe we start to think about, rather than if you can assess your environment, you can then arrange your organization to fit that environment. Maybe it's more of a question of how do we develop adaptive processes? How do we keep updating our organizations? How do we create flexible organizations and systems, really, to account for these kind of ripple effects across scales from narrow to broad? Maybe it's within your organization, maybe it's between organizations, collective level, but we do need to rethink this idea of fit to more of a process of continually adapting. And then what actions can organizations implement to, and this really brings in this idea of attention, potentially, how do you notice issues happening at various scales, whether it's a narrow scale, localized, there's this area that my factory is in tends to flood. How do we adapt to that versus, much broader scale things like climate change, global climate change? But how do we notice that? How do we build in structures to help guide our attention, and then create ways to dynamically and adaptively respond to those biophysical shifts, and particularly when they tend to interact across scales. And so, how it brings in attention, it also brings in potential for updating our theories on organizational learning. So how do we learn in these very complex settings? And then we also really think that there's a big need for look at collective action. So when effective adaptation must be system-wide, we all share the biophysical environment. These things, what we do impacts clearly by that example of the wolves. The decisions we make as organizations affect how the biophysical environment works, as well as vice versa. How do we coordinate between actors? Maybe it's collective action, maybe it's coordinated action, some of those things. So those are some things that we think are some ideas of how to update our organizational adaptation theory. And Jen, I don't know if
Yeah, no, just looking for my unmute button. Thank you so much, Brooke. And great. The wolves in Yellowstone, don't do it now, but there is a lovely 2-minute video on the reintroduction. So Brooke talked about the sort of what gave rise to the demise of wolves in Yellowstone. When they were reintroduced, what is amazing to me is it wasn't just changes in the animal and plant populations, which you would expect, but these changes actually in the sort of what we think of as the geological aspects of the environment. So the river courses changed. Literally, the river cut a new path because of the way the vegetation had changed. So even ecological scientists are surprised by the nature and the ripple effects of changes when you make one adjustment, or, you know, in this case, it's a keystone predator, as they say, when you make a big adjustment in a system. And I think that nature of how changes play out, and especially when we're dealing with issues like climate change, which we have never seen before, we will continue to be surprised. So I think hopefully we've convinced you that the 1950s version of organizations is no longer fit for purpose, even though we have many organizations and organization theories that still are stuck in the past. We can learn from that, and we are going to live with them. But the way in which we need to start thinking about change and about the kind of change, who is changing, what is changing, is it system level change, is it actor level change, how do we achieve that to meet the challenges of now, need to look very, very different from they did in the 1950s. So we have now reached the end of our comments. There's a couple of questions already in the chat, and I want to just open it up. I think, Ibrat, I'm looking for guidance from you on how we typically do that. We have about 100 folks online. So I'm happy with people coming off mute and just stating their question if they've got one, or raising their hand. Is that appropriate? And if you've already put one in the chat, feel free to come in with it. So thank you for listening. And what would you like to chat about?
Thank you, Jen and Brooke. Maybe I could just suggest to the audience that if you want to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand so we can see you. Or alternatively, you can just unmute yourself and pose your question directly to Jen and Brooke.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay.
Since I see Ravi has a question, and I don't know if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question.
It would be nice if you read it in the chat. Your voice is better than my voice, so if you can.
So Ravi's question is, without dismissing or discounting the alarmist or sky is falling view, would a different and more positive view of adaptation emerge if one metric is looked at more closely? And this metric is number of people living in a square mile of inhabitable space on Earth. The Earth has tremendous untapped capacity to absorb the growth rates. For example, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, a big part of Canada, etc. If more people move there, could reduce the scale and scope of climatic problems. Again, if a different view is needed, allow more people to move across the globe. When River Saraswati suddenly dried up centuries ago, people just migrated out. I can give a very brief thought to that. And then Jen, I don't know if you want to ask more. So in my work with my ongoing work in ecology theory and working with a few ecologists at Montana State, one thing I am learning is that each ecosystem is very different than the other. And so I can speak for instance, where I live in Bozeman, Montana, it's a beautiful outdoor paradise. I shouldn't be telling anybody this. We have had exponential growth during and after COVID. So we were about 50,000 people in my town. It has now grown to about 100,000 in 4 years. We are going to run out of water at 2033. So it is a beautiful place with not a lot of people in it, but our pressures, our environmental pressures are, you know, water scarcity is a real thing. So we're actually having quite a bit of discussion at the municipal level, at the county level, at the state level about how to manage this growth with the constraints of the biophysical environment. So that's just an anecdote to say that I think it's a very interesting thought. I think it's going to depend very greatly on the nature of ecosystems in different places around the world. And maybe those are the questions we should be asking as organization theorists is, you know, what are the ecosystems? How do we work with natural scientists more effectively to understand those differences and variation? What implications do those have for organizations? So, yeah.
Yeah, Brooke, thank you. That's a great example. And did not realize the scale of migration. Ravi, I think this illustrates something else, right? Which is we as humans and particularly organizational, think of what we teach in business schools, that there might be key variables that we can tweak and then good things will happen. Relying on any single variable, saying the answer is, simply people move or simply this aspect of the system gets shifted. What we've learned in delving into these types of theories, and many of you, use systems theory and think about these things as well, is that it's never about one thing, right? And that there are always unintended consequences. There were always ripple effects. And we as people are not very good at, and we're certainly not very good at training our MBA students and others who are going into work in organizations to think in terms of multiple variables that are interdependent. And that's part of our argument, is that we don't have the answers, but we need to start at least stepping back and saying, okay, yes, migration might be an answer. I'm not sure it's an organizational answer. It might be a human answer. It's inevitable that some of these things will happen as a response to climate change and other things, but they are going to set up other examples. I did just share the, I talked about the planetary boundaries framework as if everyone knew it. I shared a link in the chat. It is a very interesting framework that was first developed in 2015 by a number of scientists and social scientists to assess in relation to 9 key planetary systems. So basically, provision of fresh water, provision of a stable climate, etc. 9 key systems that our planet provides us that enable life on Earth and organizational life on Earth. It's an effort that they've made to sort of check where we are in relation to the boundaries of those systems. Are we within what they call a safe operating system for the planet, or are we exceeding it? Over the years, including recently in 2023, they've kept updating it. So they've realized that we are moving, encroaching some of the boundaries more, not necessarily more rapidly, but more so than when the framework was first published in 2015. So I invite you to have a look at that on your own. Wendy, thank you for downloading our paper and having a look at it. Wonderful. And an endorsement from someone like you who's thought very carefully about these issues from the paradox lens is great. So wonderful to see that resonating, and we'd love to hear feedback. In fact, we've got feedback here. I'll read Wendy's comment, but Stephanie has her hand up and we have a comment from Dennis. So Stephanie, why don't you go ahead, since you've got your hand up? I'll catch up in the chat and see if there's anything we can take. And Wendy's fed in a bunch of other really interesting papers. So Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation as well. And maybe my question also links well to the chat. Because I'm researching processes on the micro level, so I'm researching how things are changing or not changing within firms and how difficult it is to actually get firms to behave more responsible, to say it as easy as that. And I think the transformational and the systematic view that you're proposing is really, really important. But when I hear about and read about it, it's always on this macro level, like organizations interacting with organizations. And I always wonder how the micro-foundational research that has been pushed lately actually fits into that, how we can connect it both. And I guess, as Dennis also proposes, like there's a lot of like thinking in the heads of people, CEOs, I think here are mentioned, like how do we get from this micro level to the systematic level that you're proposing?
Great question, Stephanie. I'm happy to answer because I do a ton of teaching, as many of us do, particularly right now with executive audiences on sustainability. And it is, you can talk about wolves in Yellowstone, you can talk about the climate system, and then they go back and they're facing their, as someone has put in sort of challenges around short-termism and pressures. And, there's one firm that we're working very, very closely with and have been over well over a year, lots and lots of, all levels, very senior teams, etc. But the budget cycle came through and they literally were seeing the paradox themselves. And they were saying, how can I be thinking about all these bold ideas? I think one of the challenges is, and it sounds like you're doing this in your work, is having people think in terms of systems and then just throw up their hands and say it's really complex and none of us can predict it is not helpful. So how do we support people in understanding that they too are part of the system, and that the decisions that they take have to be taken from that perspective? And I use a number of examples where first, just being able to look across your value chain and thinking about, where does my impact or my opportunity for impact truly lie? It probably doesn't lie within my direct control. As everyone's rushing towards their net zero plans, for example, they're being forced to actually confront these questions. And so I think naturally some of the decision processes and some of the questions that people are asking in organizations are orienting themselves to understand, aha, okay, it's actually deep in my supply chain. It's actually the fertilizer used by my agricultural suppliers who are 3 levels down in my supply chain that are contributing to my carbon footprint. It's not my transportation vehicles, for example, or the lights in my office. So then so the first thing is being able to make those connections and see that their ability to make an impact lies not within their direct control, and then motivating them to think about, okay, what are the ways in which we might influence differently? And that's where it comes to partnership and coordination, and recognizing that, okay, it might be 3 levels deep in my supply chain. Let's just continue with that example. But how do I create innovations or contracts or opportunities for learning and experimentation that can help me better understand what shifts might be made there? Because that's not my patch, that's not my expertise. But this opens up, as you said, a whole lot of things which are uncomfortable for people who have been successful in organizations and often in decision-making positions. They need to deal with issues and parts of the value chain that they're not familiar with. They need to deal with parts of the world that they're not experts on. They need to maybe make some choices that don't work out and that they have to then learn from. And that can be extraordinarily uncomfortable. So I think everything that you're doing and that we need to do needs to help personalize what this looks like, what it could look like differently. And I'm noticing just a few of the things that Wendy's put into the chat. You know, what are the other perspectives that can be brought to the table that already have that knowledge, or that might bring wiser choices? So if I suddenly discover that it's in my agricultural supply chain and I'm going to wade in with the answer, even though I don't know it, I would be much better off learning, you know, what is the indigenous knowledge around crop growing, and why did we all force fertilizers on that anyway? You know, and these are long-term, these are processes that take time. They might feel very small at first, but the understanding and the ability for people to capture that they can not only just see the effects or see the system more broadly, but also deepen their insight into some portion of it, you don't forget that, right? So that's what keeps me slightly optimistic about all of this, is that if we help people see slightly differently, they're going to go into the next decision and the next decision and hopefully start asking those other questions. So maybe this is me sounding a bit too overly optimistic, but basically, Stephanie, keep doing the work that you're doing, because we absolutely need to bring these things down to people's decision making. And I would love to hear from you or others about what you've seen in terms of people grappling with these ideas. Because Brooke and I just put this stuff out a few years ago. And as you can see, there's many other perspectives that are complementary to it. So, okay, I'm gonna shut up for a moment and to catch up with the chat. Nitin, I've put something in about planetary boundaries. I shouldn't have said planetary systems. And so that's hopefully a response to your question. Thinking in Systems by Danella Meadows. Yeah, always a good one. Mariana, we've got several questions here. Do you want me to read them out, or do you want to come off mute and pose them? Mariana probably wants me to read them out. Are you there? So, okay.
Go ahead, Mariana.
Yeah, and yeah, no, these are good questions, definitional. So, and Brooke, I might lean on you for some of these too. So I think Penarchic, Do you want to go with the first couple, Brooke, or I can?
Sure. Yeah. So Panarchic is you can look it up. There's some papers. I can find the citations and put them in the chat here in a minute. The idea is that, you know, we would anticipate hierarchical effects, so very predictable effects. You know, if you remove like in that example, you remove the wolves, the deer population goes up. Okay, that's a hierarchical relationship. But there's so many because it's a complex adaptive system, there are lots of processes going on at the same time. So it's not just the deer to wolf relationship that's affected, it's all these other existing processes that are ongoing as well, and they're affected by that change. And so we start to see kind of ripple up and down, but also ripple out, you know, and ripple across scales. I think a simple way to think about panarchical is kind of cross scale, so narrow to broad, you know, but maybe some more ripple effects than you would anticipate. I don't know, Jen, that's a very simple, it's a very, very complex idea.
I always think about this, example, that the phrase, if you've heard it, you know, a butterfly flaps its wings in India and then there's a hurricane halfway around the world. And so we know that complex systems have these, you know, causal links between them that are unpredictable, that seem to jump across scales. And it's not literally that the butterfly flapped its wings and suddenly a hurricane was formed, but that there are things that jump around in a non-hierarchical manner. And again, not all organizations are, you know, working the way really that General Motors did in the 1950s, but by and large, we do tend to think of decision-making and actions and chains of command, right? Those are all hierarchical in nature. So our prior assumptions, of which some modern organizations have broken from, are that things ripple up and down, right? That things scale from big to large, that things, you know, there's a chain in which they go through. That's very, very different from the idea of panarchy, where the disruption and the consequences can seemingly jump around and come from, quote, anywhere. And so thank you, Brooke, for putting those links in. One other question, then I want to get onto some of the other ones, because I think, Mariana, if you read our paper, you'll get deeper insights. We could only share at a fairly high level, and I'm cognizant of the time. But I think question number 3, we do answer in the paper. I hope we do anyway. And biophysical, you know, we struggled with this a bit, right? Because we sort of wanted to think about, you know, all large scale shifts, including social shifts. But what we mean is things that are happening to and with our planet, right? The Earth and its systems, by which we don't just mean living creatures, we also mean the cycles, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, et cetera, and the geological and geophysical sort of attributes, aspects in which they inhere. So I don't know if we defined it closely in the paper, but that's what we mean. So we mean not just climate change, not just loss of biodiversity, but all of the things that are shifting in terms of, you know, freshwater provision, as Brooke's example gave, that do and will affect, increasingly will affect, in a direct manner, as I said, not just indirectly through regulation or other pressures, but that will actually affect the operation of businesses. You know, you can't grow crops without water. You can't, you know, there are huge opportunities. You will be able to navigate the Northwest Passage, which we haven't been able to do. So, you know, there are some maybe positive implications of biophysical shifts that we're facing. Hopefully that helps. Okay, now, Rafat, I think this is a great question. How would this view affect the methods we use to study organizations? Let's take that up. Anything else? Okay, methods. How would it affect the methods that we use? Any thoughts? Anyone out there who has methods that they would use or that they would prefer to see used? Because don't get me started. We have adapted some of our methods. Certainly new things are coming forward. AI itself is enabling a lot of changes in how we and everyone else does their work. But fundamentally, you know, we have many of the same methods we started with as a field. So any thoughts from you about methods that you would use to try to study this? Simulations, okay, yeah, for complex systems, certainly simulations can work because they can reveal to us the many different pathways. When we talk about panarchies, you know, there are many different pathways. Agent-based modeling, machine learning, okay, cool. Yeah, this is all stuff that I rely on you to take up because I'm too old to learn about all of that. Any other? You know, I'm a qualitative researcher, and I might be, you know, I might be completely out of my depth. It might be impossible for me to do the kinds of things that Brooke and I have described if I'm only doing qualitative research. Although Ellie, you're got my back. Process studies might be possible. Big data and causality, okay. So there are definitely opportunities for big data to understand complex systems. Ellie, process studies. Do I have a future if I'm a qualitative researcher who does process? And thank you, Charlotte, for saying, yes, Francis Wesley was talking about these ideas way before it was cool in our field. Thank you for that citation. Actor network theory, a theory that connects different actors, be they human or non-human, very actually could be quite productive. So, okay, so we've started to mention some theories that could be useful as sort of conceptual handholds, as we say, in studying these. Social constructionism, social systems theory. Yep, we have lots of choices of theories. Methodologically, they don't always adhere to theories. And I'm being slightly provocative. I do think there's still a role for qualitative methods, not just big data kinds of methods. We do need to understand on the ground realities. So this is coming a little bit back to what we were talking about in response to Stephanie's question, which is we too are part of these complex systems, as are our mental models, as are our understandings, our interactions, as are our grounded sort of truths that we see. And so part of what Brooke and I'm going to cue you up for a moment here, Brooke, we're thinking about when we developed this paper was in the background very much, and is now coming to the foreground through these data and other work that she's done, is studying organizations that connect lots of different entities and actors, and understanding how the knowledge and the expertise that those different entities and actors have can be combined in a way, not that everyone knows the same thing, but they have access to different parts of the system that they might not have been exposed to. So it keeps everyone embedded in their local, quote, reality. It keeps them focused, their attention focused on the things that they should be focused on, but it enables more sensing of the whole system. And there are ways to study that qualitatively. Obviously, it has limitations in terms of, you know, potentially geographical scale. But Brooke, do you want to say anything more on methods?
Sure. I think what's interesting is Eldon's comment, which I think is very valid as well, with the methods, is temporality is a large part of this for sure. So narrow scale, when you look at scale and you unpack it, you can unpack it as spatial scale, which would be a localized, I said that word earlier, versus a broader area. But there's also temporality. So narrow localized processes in the biophysical environment tend to unfold a little bit, you know, in the shorter term, we see those effects, whereas something like global climate change, it's going to take a very long time to appear at a global level. So spatial and temporal scale are very important to consider in this type of, when looking at the biophysical. We're working on a paper, Jen and I, and we are looking at, you know, this idea that, well, based on Tima Bonsall and co-authors' work and some others, that, you know, if these challenges with humans who run organizations, who populate organizations, make decisions for organizations, have a really hard time. We're very challenged in bounded cognition, you know, these terms that we know, in attending to complex processes that have a lot of moving parts. We also have are challenged in paying attention to these types of biophysical processes that take a long time to unfold and or unfold over a longer, broader spatial area. We are very good at paying attention to localized issues. And so when we think back to this idea of panarchy, where do we even start? How do we even start to think about complex adaptive systems? How do we, even start to see what they are, notice them? So we're interested in this question of, if you have these actors distributed at different parts of the system, how can they develop structures to share the information on the system that they're learning in their position in the system, and then have some sort of way to coordinate sharing the right information at the right time to the right people, so that information can then be used effectively for collective learning of the system dynamics, and then be able to develop action at the level that they can implement the action effectively. So Jen, I don't know how detailed you want me to get into it, but we're looking at like a regional wine industry and how distributed actors, vineyard firms work with a nonprofit organization, certification agency to, over almost a 20-year period, learn the system dynamics and develop practices that can help distributed actors in the system operate within those biophysical constraints.
Yeah, thank you. And some great comments in the chat. I hope Ibrat and Joseph, we are able to capture some of these and maybe even circulate, because we're reminded that, there's nothing new under the sun. And, even though the trend is we all seem to be stuck in the 1950s in some ways, or 60s or 70s in terms of our organization theory, some people were truly ahead of their time, and there's a number of great links that we're being given, and I think just to emphasize what Brooke said, it's the spatial scale that we tend to think of, but it's also the temporal scale, and Eldon has put something in the chat about that too. The bottom line is, I think all methods are needed and applicable because every method has a functionality, right? If you ask me what's the best method, the answer is it depends what question I'm asking. And so there are so many questions to ask. Is it about, how people see or a challenge to see these issues, or is it about some of the large scale interactions that we might, so the former would be much easier to do through a qualitative method that gets really close into the action and actors. But the latter being some of you have recommended simulation or big data. If we want to look at large scale interactions on which we have a huge corpus of data and we can maybe trace how those unfold over time, that would be brilliant for that. So there are enough problems, I think, to tackle in this area that every method is welcome. But like any situation, you need to be careful that the method that you've chosen is the right tool for the job. Okay, what have we missed in terms of questions? I have a proposal, which is that if you've got a question buried in the chat, I'm having that, it's wonderful to see all the activity in the chat, but I'm not able to keep up. Please raise your virtual hand, whether you have a question in the chat or whether you just want to raise your virtual hand and raise something. We have a closing few minutes still left for discussion, and it would be great to see what else is on your mind, even if it's completely from left field. Peter Bryant, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Does this also raise questions about how we do the work, how we theorize, and how we organize ourselves? I mean, if we're going to, the complexity, the multidisciplinarity, the multi-methods, do we need to think differently about how we do theory?
It sounds like there's an implicit sense.
There's an implicit idea of bigger teams, doing more multiple things in a coordinated fashion to try and get a grip on this.
Well, Brooke, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think there's a lot of ways that we can approach this, from methods and theories that we have in organization studies. We've talked about a lot of them already. And as Jen mentioned, matching your methods to your question is probably the most important. I do think, we also as organizational scholars suffer the same constraints that organizations do in terms of our attention and cognition. So leveraging scientific expertise, in fields outside of our own is a wise thing to do. Work with ecologists. We don't have to also be ecologists as organization theorists. We can work with people who are experts in those fields. We know that there are lots of challenges with interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work. There are some very cool papers that have come out. I'm trying to think of one. Is Amanda Williams and Transdisciplinary Work for Sustainability. Very good paper. I'll find that link. But we need to, that's another question, is how do we work interdisciplinarily? How do we do that to achieve what we need to know as organizational scholars and deliver to organizations? Also help, it can't be a one-way thing. How do we, have deliverables be value to our partners as well? Those are my thoughts on that. I think it's very vital. I'm working with some ecologists currently, earth scientists, and I'm realizing that I need to read some in their field to understand their vocabulary, but I don't need to learn it all, which is really liberating, actually. I need to learn better how to apply it through management and organization lens. That's kind of the part that I need to learn and develop. And Jen, I don't know what more you have on that.
No, that's great. I think, Peter, it's a great question. And I agree. It's not necessarily about larger teams. It's probably about more diverse teams, as Brooke said. She's been much more successful than me. I wander into our local, plant science experts or geography departments and whatnot. And I say to them, can you tell me about ecological theory? And then they say back to me, can you tell me about organization theory? And I'm like, oh gosh, how long do you have? So part of it is that ability to actually have, and somebody just put in the chat, it's the right research question, or it's like the focused sort of thing, because I think we don't know what we don't know. So when we say work with people who know things differently that might be useful, that takes a lot of effort and time. And I think it's great that Brooke is doing, and you've mentioned other things like conservation organizations. Some organizations are already working across diverse temporal and spatial scales, and we can learn a great deal from them. They don't need to be business organizations, and they don't need to be things that we as organizational scholars have a monopoly on, right? So let's go work with conservation scientists and study conservation organizations and bring that knowledge forward. And the other thing I'll just say, this is my personal opinion, and those of you who are junior scholars, it's amazing. Do really good, rigorous academic work, because we need rigorous work, but we also need work that is oriented to questions that organizations urgently need to answer. So I think this is also why every method can still apply and every approach can still apply and is needed to tackle some of these questions, which is ultimately, if we want to help organizations understand how they need to adapt and throw away the theories that we've been telling them through our teaching and our sort of business school like 101 kind of stuff over the decades, we need to really lean into the realities that they're facing. And so I think it's having your research informed by what business organizations care to understand and finding a way to then translate it and bring it to those audiences. So Peter, that's a great question, and I think challenges all of us. I think there was a question in here.
There was a question that was repeated about AI. How I think it might have been Felipe, if I'm saying that name correctly.
Yeah. So I saw that too. Okay. Sorry, Felipe, for not getting that. Can AI help? Absolutely. How? I don't know. Another part of my life is, quote, future of work. And trust me, I'm getting asked all sorts of questions on AI, but I think, and I think this is something that Brooke and I had to do in working on this paper, which is we can easily slip into the how organizations have to adapt and how managers have to think in order for their organizations to adapt to this new world. but actually we were writing for an organization theory journal, and we were trying to argue how organizational theory has to adapt, which then in turn hopefully will inform how managers need to think and organizations need to adapt. So with AI, I think we could slip into the, how is this a tool for solving this practical problem for organizations adapting, as opposed to how much it might challenge our theories. I'm not saying only one of them can be asked. Both of them absolutely need to be asked. But, you know, I talk to a lot of people who say, you know, it's amazing. AI can do, you know, it can sense soil quality. It can sense all sorts of stuff. I was actually at a presentation, fascinating presentation by a colleague at Cambridge who studies Russian boreal forests, which actually are changing rapidly, but not as rapidly as they think as a result of climate change. He was making the case for the fact that obviously the recent couple of years have made it impossible for international science to be conducted on the ground, as they used to do in Russia. And I said, well, surely with AI and satellite sensing capabilities, you know, you can get everything you need to know about how the forests are growing. And he said, no, we can't. We can get a great deal, but what we don't understand are, again, the social ecological systems. He didn't use that term, but he said, we need to send field scientists in, not just to understand what's actually going on, but also how people are interacting with forests and the cultural aspects and, you know, the policy aspects and all of those things, which I thought was really interesting coming from a plant scientist. So the bottom line is, I think there are many ways in which we, through our research, might add AI to our toolbox. There are many, many ways in which organizations are undoubtedly adding AI to our toolbox. And I think some of those in the ways that people have raised, you know, the ability to capture and analyze massive quantities of data, and extract from those data trends and insights that we might not otherwise see, or it might take us a billion years to just discover in other ways, is enormous. But I don't think it's the magic wand. I was in a conversation a few weeks ago where somebody said, you know, we always overestimate the effect of new technology in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. And I think we're in the short run still on generative AI. We're rapidly going into the long run, but we are in a phase where I think everyone's getting super freaked out and or excited about AI. So I think as scholars, we need to think carefully about what are the ways that we can use it to enhance not only our own knowledge generation, but also the knowledge generation of organizations for good. Ebrat has his hand up, and I think we're about to wrap up.
Jen, so question, we talked a lot about organizational change, and we also implicitly started talking about how we need to change perhaps our methods and possibly even theoretical lenses, you know, how we understand the phenomena. But I suppose I was wondering if you could comment on, you know, how we might also need to change our institution of publication to adjust to this kind of doing interdisciplinary research or pushing kind of novel theoretical approaches.
Well, I'll take that, and then love to hear Brooke's and others' thought on it. Yeah, as a former editor and deputy editor at AMJ, I have some thoughts on this. I think our norms around publication are extremely important because, as I just said, it produces very, very rigorous social science in our case, and that's important. But it also produces things that might be more rigorous than the average person needs to know. It also produces many, many, many chunks that might add up to an answer. So we need to, as scholars, be able to say, it's not just one paper or my paper in particular that quote solves this problem or that tackles this or that can create an impact in terms of how people in organizations think about these questions. We need to actually look at and respect the whole, not the whole, but a swath of scholarship, and the conversations, because at the end of the day, actually, I think that's what we do have as academics, is the ability to stand back from the noise a bit. And what I was just saying about AI, actually resonates. I mean, I am not an AI expert, but I've been called in to present to very senior people about what this means in terms of the overall, within the overall construct of future of work. And it's fascinating because we as scholars, we've seen many technology developments. We have a lot of scholarship on how technologies impact on organizations. And the answer is, it's more complex than you think. You know, and these things are insightful, right? So we can step back as academics because we have the time, we have the perspective, and we have this body of scholarship, which, don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of good stuff, even in the 1950s and since then, that's come out of our field. And we have the ability to reflect on it, distill it, and ideally help people in organizations widen their perspective and get that big picture. Okay, all things being equal, you know, this thing can work in these kind of settings, or this might be better than that. We're not giving them the answer, but we're pulling them out of that busyness of their day-to-day deliverables and decisions that, you know, that they're constantly pushed into, and maybe pushing a sort of a more reactive sense. We're helping them pull away. So don't necessarily think about, I've got to publish in a different place. Publish where you publish, but step back and appreciate the knowledge that we create as a community and think about, how can I help organizations? You know, they're not going to read your ASQ paper or whatever, but how can I help them understand what that might mean in their world and inquire as to what questions they have, so I can bring forward some things that are informed by our body of scholarship. That was a long way of saying we're not perfect, but I think we have something to offer. Brooke, your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree. I think, you know, what I'll add to that is just that depending on where you are in your career or what your goals are as an academic, there's also, you know, so much value in publishing work that builds theory, or that, like we're saying, you know, updates our theories. Like, we actually, this is an opportunity to really use our theories that we have and update them, build new theories. There's also, you know, other types of articles to write. You know, our essay is one example, or review pieces, or you know, there's other article types than theory building. But I think, you know, if we don't have theory building going on in the management scholarship, then we're I mean, you know, I don't want to say the word stagnate, but, you know, we need to keep ideas going, and then we can have these other types of articles, you know, also kind of adding to the conversation as well. So kind of looking at work as a portfolio, or having these different outlets is also maybe useful to think about. Yeah, I think those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah. Certainly the recent, not just recent, but all of the things that people have put in the chat as additional recommended reading echo that, or illustrations of that. But I think we're at the half hour, and it's wonderful. It's been very inspiring to hear your reflections, all the stuff in the chat showing up. Hopefully it's twigged some new ideas. Maybe you're interested in looking up our paper. Hopefully you're interested in looking up many more papers that have been, and books and things that have been written before and since that people have recommended. And best of luck to everyone in their work. I will say, as I am the vice chair of the RRBM organization. I'm relatively new to it, but it's people like Ibrat and Joseph who have pulled together these opportunities, who are truly the inspiring force behind this. So thank you to you, and thank you to all in the community, and good luck with your research, which is going to make a difference.